Section 20 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 20. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 1. One thing alone was wanting to assure the success of the vast projects that the Pope and his son were founding upon the friendship of Louis and an alliance with him, that is, money. But Alexander was not the man to be troubled about a paltry worry of that kind. True, the sale of benefices was by now exhausted, the ordinary and extraordinary taxes had already been collected for the whole year, and the prospect of inheritance from cardinals and priests was a poor thing now that the richest of them had been poisoned. But Alexander had other means at his disposal, which were none the less efficacious because they were less often used. The first he employed was to spread a report that the Turks were threatening an invasion of Christendom, and that he knew for a positive fact that before the end of the summer Bajazet would land two considerable armies, one in Romagna, the other in Calabria. He therefore published two bulls, one to levy tithes of all ecclesiastical revenues in Europe of whatever nature they might be, the other to force the Jews into paying an equivalent sum. Both bulls contained the severest sentences of excommunication against those who refused to submit, or attempted opposition. The second plan was the selling of indulgences, a thing which had never been done before. These indulgences affected the people who had been prevented by reasons of health or business from coming to Rome for the Jubilee. The journey by this expedient was rendered unnecessary, and sins were pardoned for a third of what it would have cost, and just as completely as if the faithful had fulfilled every condition of the pilgrimage. For gathering in this tax, a veritable army of collectors was instituted, a certain Lodovico della Torre at their head. The sum that Alexander brought into the pontifical treasury is incalculable, and some idea of it may be gathered from the fact that 799,000 livres in gold was paid in from the territory of Venice alone. But as the Turks did as a fact make some sort of demonstration from the Hungarian side, and the Venetians began to fear that they might be coming in their direction, they asked for help from the Pope, who gave orders that at 12 o'clock in the day, in all his states an Ave Maria should be said to pray God to avert the danger which was threatening the most serene republic. This was the only help the Venetians got from his Holiness in exchange for the 799,000 livres in gold that he had got from them. But it seemed as though God wished to show his strange vicar on earth that he was angered by the mockery of sacred things, and on the eve of St. Peter's Day, just as the Pope was passing the Campanile on his way to the tribune of benedictions, an enormous piece of iron broke off and fell at his feet, and then, as though one warning had not been enough, on the next day, St. Peter's, when the Pope happened to be in one of the rooms of his ordinary dwelling with the Cardinal Capuano and Monsignore Poto, his private chamberlain, he saw through the open windows that a very black cloud was coming up. Foreseeing a thunderstorm, he ordered the Cardinal and the Chamberlain to shut the windows. He had not been mistaken, for even as they were obeying his command, there came up such a furious gust of wind that the highest chimney of the Vatican was overturned, just as a tree is rooted up, and was dashed upon the roof, breaking it in, smashing the upper flooring. It fell into the very room where they were. Terrified by the noise of this catastrophe, which made the whole palace tremble, the Cardinal and Monsignore Poto turned round, and seeing the room full of dust and debris, sprang out upon the parapet and shouted to the guards at the gate, "The Pope is dead! The Pope is dead!" At this cry the guards ran up, and discovered 3 persons lying in the rubbish on the floor, one dead and the other 2 dying. The dead man was a gentleman of Siena called Lorenzo Chigi, and the dying were 2 resident officials of the Vatican. They had been walking across the floor above, and had been flung down with the debris. But Alexander was not to be found, and as he gave no answer, though they kept on calling to him, the belief that he had perished was confirmed, and very soon spread about the town. But he had only fainted, and at the end of a certain time he began to come to himself, and moaned, whereupon he was discovered, dazed with the blow, and injured, though not seriously, in several parts of his body. He had been saved by little short of a miracle. A beam had broken in half, and had left each of its two ends in the side walls, and one of these had formed a sort of roof over the pontifical throne. The Pope, who was sitting there at the time, was protected by this overarching beam, and had received only a few contusions. The two contradictory reports of the sudden death and the miraculous preservation of the Pope spread rapidly through Rome, and the Duke of Valentinois, terrified at the thought of what a change might be wrought in his own fortunes by any slight accident to the Holy Father, hurried to the Vatican, unable to assure himself by anything less than the evidence of his own eyes. Alexander desired to render public thanks to Heaven for the protection that had been granted him, and on the very same day was carried to the church of Santa Maria del Popolo. Escorted by a numerous procession of prelates and men-at-arms, his pontifical seat borne by two valets, two equerries, and two grooms. In this church were buried the Duke of Gandia and Gian Borgia, and perhaps Alexander was drawn thither by some relics of devotion, or maybe by the recollection of his love for his former mistress, Rosa Bonazza, whose image, in the guise of the Madonna, was exposed for the veneration of the faithful in a chapel on the left of the high altar. Stopping before this altar, the Pope offered to the church the gift of a magnificent chalice in which were 300 gold crowns, which the Cardinal of Siena poured out into a silver paten before the eyes of all, much to the gratification of the pontifical vanity. But before he left Rome to complete the conquest of the Romagna, the Duke of Valentinois had been reflecting that the marriage, once so ardently desired, between Lucrezia and Alfonso had been quite useless to himself and his father. There was more than this to be considered. Louis XII's rest in Lombardy was only a halt, and Milan was evidently but the stage before Naples. It was very possible that Louis was annoyed about the marriage which converted his enemy's nephew into the son-in-law of his ally. Whereas, if Alfonso were dead, Lucrezia would be in the position to marry some powerful lord of Ferrara or Brescia, who would be able to help his brother-in-law in the conquest of Romagna. Alfonso was now not only useless but dangerous, which to any one with the character of the Borgias perhaps seemed worse. The death of Alfonso was resolved upon. But Lucrezia's husband, who had understood for a long time past what danger he incurred by living near his terrible father-in-law, had retired to Naples. Since, however, neither Alexander nor Caesar had changed in their perpetual dissimulation towards him, he was beginning to lose his fear, when he received an invitation from the Pope and his son to take part in a bullfight which was to be held in the Spanish fashion in honour of the Duke before his departure. In the present precarious position of Naples, it would not have been good policy for Alfonso to afford Alexander any sort of pretext for a rupture, so he could not refuse without a motive, and betook himself to Rome. It was thought of no use to consult Lucrezia in this affair, for she had 2 or 3 times displayed an absurd attachment for her husband, and they left her undisturbed in her government of Spoleto. Alfonso was received by the Pope and the Duke with every demonstration of sincere friendship, and rooms in the Vatican were assigned to him that he had inhabited before with Lucrezia, in that part of the building which is known as the Torre Nuova. Great lists were prepared on the Piazza of St. Peter's, the streets about it were barricaded, and the windows of the surrounding houses served as boxes for the spectators. The Pope and his court took their places on the balconies of the Vatican. The fete was started by professional toreadors, after they had exhibited their strength and skill. Alfonso and Caesar in their turn descended to the arena, and to offer a proof of their mutual kindness, settled that the bull which pursued Caesar should be killed by Alfonso, and the bull that pursued Alfonso by Caesar. Then Caesar remained alone on horseback within the lists, Alfonso going out by an improvised door which was kept ajar, in order that he might go back on the instant if he judged that his presence was necessary. At the same time, from the opposite side of the lists the bull was introduced, and was at the same moment pierced all over with darts and arrows, some of them containing explosives, which took fire, and irritated the bull to such a point that he rolled about with pain, and then got up in a fury, and perceiving a man on horseback, rushed instantly upon him. It was now, in this narrow arena, pursued by his swift enemy, that Caesar displayed all that skill which made him one of the finest horsemen of the period. Still, Clever as he was, he could not have remained safe long in that restricted area from an adversary against whom he had no other resource than flight, had not Alfonso appeared suddenly, just when the bull was beginning to gain upon him, waving a red cloak in his left hand, and holding in his right a long, delicate Aragon sword. It was high time; the bull was only a few paces distant from Caesar, and the risk he was running appeared so imminent that a woman's scream was heard from one of the windows. But at the sight of a man on foot the bull stopped short, and judging that he would do better business with the new enemy than the old one, he turned upon him instead. For a moment he stood motionless, roaring, kicking up the dust with his hind feet, and lashing his sides with his tail. Then he rushed upon Alfonso, his eyes all bloodshot, his horns tearing up the ground. Alfonso awaited him with a tranquil air; then, when he was only 3 paces away, he made a bound to one side and presented instead of his body his sword, which disappeared at once to the hilt. The bull, checked in the middle of his onslaught, stopped one instant motionless and trembling, then fell upon his knees, uttered one dull roar, and lying down on the very spot where his course had been checked, breathed his last without moving a single step forward. Applause resounded on all sides, so rapid and clever had been the blow. Caesar had remained on horseback, seeking to discover the fair spectator who had given so lively a proof of her interest in him, without troubling himself about what was going on. His search had not been unrewarded, for he had recognized one of the maids of honor to Elizabeth, Duchess of Urbino, who was betrothed to Gian Battista Caricualo, captain general of the Republic of Venice. It was now Alfonso's turn to run from the bull, Caesar's to fight him. The young men changed parts, and when 4 mules had reluctantly dragged the dead bull from the arena, and the valets and other servants of his holiness had scattered sand over the places that were stained with blood, Alfonso mounted a magnificent Andalusian steed of Arab origin, light as the wind of Sahara that had wedded with his mother, while Caesar, dismounting, retired in his turn, to reappear at the moment when Alfonso should be meeting the same danger from which he had just now rescued him. Then a second bull was introduced upon the scene, excited in the same manner with steel darts and flaming arrows. Like his predecessor, when he perceived a man on horseback he rushed upon him, and then began a marvellous race, in which it was impossible to see, so quickly did they fly over the ground, whether the horse was pursuing the bull, or the bull the horse. But after 5 or 6 rounds, the bull began to gain upon the son of Araby, for all his speed, and it was plain to see who fled and who pursued. In another moment there was only the length of 2 lances between them, and then suddenly Caesar appeared, armed with one of those long 2-handed swords which the French are accustomed to use, and just when the bull, almost close upon Don Alfonso, came in front of Caesar he brandished the sword, which flashed like lightning and cut off his head, while his body, impelled by the speed of the run, fell to the ground 10 paces farther on. This blow was so unexpected, and had been performed with such dexterity, that it was received, not with mere clapping, but with wild enthusiasm and frantic outcry. Caesar, apparently remembering nothing else in his hour of triumph but the scream that had been caused by his former danger, picked up the bull's head, and, giving it to one of his equerries, ordered him to lay it, as an act of homage, at the feet of the fair Venetian who had bestowed upon him so lively a sign of interest. This fate, besides affording a triumph to each of the young men, had another end as well. It was meant to prove to the populace that perfect goodwill existed between the two, since each had saved the life of the other. The result was, that, if any accident should happen to Caesar, nobody would dream of accusing Alfonso, and if any accident should happen to Alfonso, nobody would dream of accusing Caesar. There was a supper at the Vatican. Alfonso made an elegant toilet, and about 10 o'clock at night prepared to go from the quarters he inhabited into those where the Pope lived. But the door which separated the 2 courts of the building was shut, and knock as he would, no one came to open it. Alfonso then thought that it was a simple matter for him to go round by the Piazza of St. Peter, so he went out unaccompanied through one of the garden gates of the Vatican and made his way across the gloomy streets which led to the stairway which gave on the piazza. But scarcely had he set foot on the first step when he was attacked by a band of armed men. Alfonso would have drawn his sword, but before it was out of the scabbard he had received 2 blows from a halberd, one on his head, the other on his shoulder. He was stabbed in the side, and wounded both in the leg and in the temple. Struck down by these 5 blows, he lost his footing and fell to the ground unconscious. His assassins, supposing he was dead, at once remounted the stairway, and found on the piazza 40 horsemen waiting for them. By them they were calmly escorted from the city by the Porta Portesa. Alfonso was found at the point of death, but not actually dead, by some passers-by, some of whom recognized him, and instantly conveyed the news of his assassination to the Vatican, while the others, lifting the wounded man in their arms, carried him to his quarters in the Torre Nuova. The Pope and Caesar, who learned this news just as they were sitting down to table, showed great distress, and leaving their companions, at once went to see Alfonso, to be quite certain whether his wounds were fatal or not; and on the next morning, to divert any suspicion that might be turned towards themselves, they arrested Alfonso's maternal uncle, Francesco Gazella, who had come to Rome in his nephew's company. Gazella was found guilty on the evidence of false witnesses, and was consequently beheaded. But they had only accomplished half of what they wanted. By some means, fair or foul, suspicion had been sufficiently diverted from the true assassins. But Alfonso was not dead. And thanks to the strength of his constitution and the skill of his doctors, who had taken the lamentations of the Pope and Caesar quite seriously, and thought to please them by curing Alexander's son-in-law, the wounded man was making progress towards convalescence. News arrived at the same time that Lucrezia had heard of her husband's accident, and was starting to come and nurse him herself. There was no time to lose, and Caesar summoned Michelotto. The same night, says Bucardus, Don Alfonso, who would not die of his wounds, was found strangled in his bed. The funeral took place the next day with a ceremony not unbecoming in itself, though unsuited to his high rank. Don Francesco Borgia, Archbishop of Cosenza, acted as chief mourner at St. Peter's, where the body was buried in the chapel of Santa Maria della Febbre. Lucrezia arrived the same evening. She knew her father and brother too well to be put on the wrong scent, and although immediately after Alfonso's death the Duke of Valentinois had arrested the doctors, the surgeons, and a poor deformed wretch who had been acting as valet, she knew perfectly well from what quarter the blow had proceeded. In fear, therefore, that the manifestation of a grief she felt at this time too well might alienate the confidence of her father and brother, she retired to Nepi with her whole household, her whole court, and more than 600 cavaliers, there to spend the period of her mourning. This important family business was now settled, and Lucrezia was again a widow, and in consequence ready to be utilized in the Pope's new political machinations. Caesar only stayed at Rome to receive the ambassadors from France and Venice, but as their arrival was somewhat delayed, and considerable inroads had been made upon the Pope's treasury by the recent festivities, the creation of 12 new cardinals was arranged. This scheme was to have 2 effects, viz., to bring 600,000 ducats into the pontifical chest, each hat having been priced at 50,000 ducats, and to assure the Pope of a constant majority in the Sacred Council. End of section number 20. Section 21 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 21. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 2. The ambassadors at last arrived. The first was M. de Villeneuve, the same who had come before to see the Duke of Valentinois in the name of France. Just as he entered Rome, he met on the road a masked man who, without removing his domino, expressed the joy he felt at his arrival. This man was Caesar himself, who did not wish to be recognized, and who took his departure after a short conference without uncovering his face. M. de Villeneuve then entered the city after him, and at the Porta del Populo found the ambassadors of the various powers, and among them those of Spain and Naples, whose sovereigns were not yet, it is true, in declared hostility to France, though there was already some coolness. The last named, fearing to compromise themselves, merely said to their colleague of France, by way of complimentary address, "Sir, you are welcome," whereupon the master of the ceremonies, surprised at the brevity of the greeting, asked if they had nothing else to say. When they replied that they had not, M. de Villeneuve turned his back upon them, remarking that those who had nothing to say required no answer. He then took his place between the Archbishop of Reggio, governor of Rome, and the Archbishop of Ragusa, and made his way to the Palace of the Holy Apostles, which had been got ready for his reception. Some days later, Maria Giorgi, ambassador extraordinary of Venice, made his arrival. He was commissioned not only to arrange the business on hand with the pope, but also to convey to Alexander and Caesar the title of Venetian nobles, and to inform them that their names were inscribed in the Golden Book, a favor that both of them had long coveted, less for the empty honor's sake than for the new influence that this title might confer. Then the pope went on to bestow the 12 cardinals' hats that had been sold. The new princes of the church were Don Diego de Mendoza, Archbishop of Seville; Jacques, Archbishop of Oristani; the pope's vicar general, Thomas, Archbishop of Strigania; Piero, Archbishop of Reggio; governor of Rome, Francesco Borgia, Archbishop of Cosenza; treasurer general, Gian, Archbishop of Salerno, vice chamberlain; Luigi Borgia, Archbishop of Valencia, secretary to his holiness, and brother of the Gian Borgia whom Caesar had poisoned; Antonio, Bishop of Coma; Gian Battista Ferraro, Bishop of Modena; Amadei d'Albret, son of the King of Navarre, brother-in-law of the Duke of Valentinois; and Marco Cornaro, a Venetian noble, in whose person his holiness rendered back to the most serene republic the favor he had just received. Then, as there was nothing further to detain the Duke of Valentinois at Rome, he only waited to effect a loan from a rich banker named Agostino Chigi, brother of the Lorenzo Chigi who had perished on the day when the pope had been nearly killed by the fall of a chimney, and departed for the Romagna, accompanied by Vitellozzo Vitelli, Gian Paolo Baglioni, and Jacopo di Santa Croce, at the time his friends, but later on his victims. His first enterprise was against Pesaro. This was the polite attention of a brother-in-law, and Gian Sforza very well knew what would be its consequences; for instead of attempting to defend his possessions by taking up arms, or venture on negotiations, unwilling moreover to expose the fair lands he had ruled so long to the vengeance of an irritated foe, he begged his subjects to preserve their former affection towards himself, in the hope of better days to come, and he fled into Dalmatia. Malatesta, lord of Rimini, followed his example. Thus the Duke of Valentinois entered both these towns without striking a single blow. Caesar left a sufficient garrison behind him, and marched on to Faenza. But there the face of things was changed. Faenza at that time was under the rule of Astor Manfredi, a brave and handsome young man of 18, who, relying on the love of his subjects towards his family, had resolved on defending himself to the uttermost, although he had been forsaken by the Bentivogli, his near relatives, and by his allies, the Venetian and Florentines, who had not dared to send him any aid because of the affection felt towards Caesar by the King of France. Accordingly, when he perceived that the Duke of Valentinois was marching against him, he assembled in hot haste all those of his vassals who were capable of bearing arms, together with the few foreign soldiers who were willing to come into his pay, and collecting victual and ammunition, he took up his position with them inside the town. By these defensive preparations Caesar was not greatly disconcerted. He commanded a magnificent army, composed of the finest troops of France and Italy, led by such men as Paolo and Giulio Orsini, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Paolo Baglione, not to speak of himself, that is to say, by the first captains of the period. So, after he had reconnoitred, he at once began the siege, pitching his camp between the two rivers, Amanna and Marziano, placing his artillery on the side which faces on Forli, at which point the besieged army had erected a powerful bastion. At the end of a few days busy with entrenchments, the breach became practicable, and the Duke of Valentinois ordered an assault, and gave the example to his soldiers by being the first to march against the enemy. But in spite of his courage and that of his captains beside him, Astor Manfredi made so good a defense that the besiegers were repulsed with great loss of men, while one of their bravest leaders, Onario Savella, was left behind in the trenches. But Faenza, in spite of the courage and devotion of her defenders, could not have held out long against so formidable an army, had not winter come to her aid. Surprised by the rigour of the season, with no houses for protection and no trees for fuel, as the peasants had destroyed both beforehand, the Duke of Valentinois was forced to raise the siege and take up his winter quarters in the neighbouring towns, in order to be quite ready for a return next spring; for Caesar could not forgive the insult of being held in check by a little town which had enjoyed a long time of peace, was governed by a mere boy, and deprived of all outside aid, and had sworn to take his revenge. He therefore broke up his army into 3 sections, sent 1/3 to Imola, the second to Forli, and himself took the third to Cesena, a third-rate town, which was thus suddenly transformed into a city of pleasure and luxury. Indeed, for Caesar's active spirit there must needs be no cessation of warfare or festivities; so, when war was interrupted, fetes began, as magnificent and as exciting as he knew how to make them. The days were passed in games and displays of horsemanship, the nights in dancing and gallantry, for the loveliest woman of the Romagna, that is to say of the whole world, had come hither to make a seraglio for the victor, which might have been envied by the Sultan of Egypt or the Emperor of Constantinople. While the Duke of Valentinois was making one of his excursions in the neighbourhood of the town with his retinue of flattering nobles and titled courtesans, who were always about him, he noticed a cortege on the Rimini road, so numerous that it must surely indicate the approach of someone of importance. Caesar, soon perceiving that the principal person was a woman, approached, and recognized the very same lady in waiting to the Duchess of Urbino who, on the day of the bullfight, had screamed when Caesar was all but touched by the infuriated beast. At this time she was betrothed, as we mentioned, to Gian Caracciolo, general of the Venetians. Elizabeth of Gonzaga, her protectress and grandmother, was now sending her with a suitable retinue to Venice, where the marriage was to take place. Caesar had already been struck by the beauty of this young girl when at Rome, but when he saw her again she appeared more lovely than on the first occasion; so he resolved on the instant that he would keep this fair flower of love for himself, having often before reproached himself for his indifference in passing her by. Therefore he saluted her as an old acquaintance, inquired whether she was staying any time at Cesena, and ascertained that she was only passing through, travelling by long stages, as she was awaited with much impatience, and that she would spend the coming night at Forli. This was all that Caesar cared to know. He summoned Micheletto, and in a low voice said a few words to him, which were heard by no one else. The cortege only made a halt at the neighbouring town, as the fair bride had said, and started at once for Forli, although the day was already far advanced. But scarcely had a league been covered when a troop of horsemen from Cesena overtook and surrounded them. Although the soldiers in the escort were far from being in sufficient force, they were eager to defend their general's bride; but soon some fell dead, and others, terrified, took to flight; and when the lady came down from her litter to try to escape, the chief seized her in his arms and set her in front of him on his horse; then, ordering his men to return to Cesena without him, he put his horse to the gallop in a cross direction, and as the shades of evening were now beginning to fall, he soon disappeared into the darkness. Caracciolo learned the news through one of the fugitives, who declared that he had recognized among the ravishers the Duke of Valentinois' soldiers. At first he thought his ears had deceived him, so hard was it to believe this terrible intelligence; but it was repeated, and he stood for one instant motionless and, as it were, thunderstruck. Then suddenly, with a cry of vengeance, he threw off his stupor and dashed away to the ducal palace, where sat the Doge Barberigo and the Council of Ten. Unannounced he rushed into their midst, the very moment after they had heard of Caesar's outrage. "Most serene lords," he cried, "I am come to bid you farewell, for I am resolved to sacrifice my life to my private vengeance, though indeed I had hoped to devote it to the service of the republic. I have been wounded in the soul's noblest part, in my honor. The dearest thing I possessed, my wife, has been stolen from me, and the thief is the most treacherous, the most impious, the most infamous of men. It is Valentinois. My lords, I beg you will not be offended if I speak thus of a man whose boast it is to be a member of your noble ranks, and to enjoy your protection. It is not so; he lies, and his loose and criminal life has made him unworthy of such honours, even as he is unworthy of the life whereof my sword shall deprive him. In truth, his very birth was a sacrilege; he is a fratricide, a usurper of the goods of other men, an oppressor of the innocent, and a highway assassin. He is a man who will violate every law, even the law of hospitality respected by the veriest barbarian; a man who will do violence to a virgin who is passing through his own country, where she had every right to expect from him not only the consideration due to her sex and condition, but also that which is due to the most serene republic, whose condottieri I am, and which is insulted in my person and in the dishonouring of my bride. This man, I say, merits indeed to die by another hand than mine. Yet, since he who ought to punish him is not for him a prince and judge, but only a father quite as guilty as the son, I myself will seek him out, and I will sacrifice my own life, not only in avenging my own injury, and the blood of so many innocent beings, but also in promoting the welfare of the most serene republic, on which it is his ambition to trample when he has accomplished the ruin of the other princes of Italy. The Doge and the senators, who, as we said, were already apprised of the event that had brought Caracciolo before them, listened with great interest and profound indignation, for they, as he told them, were themselves insulted in the person of their general. They all swore, on their honour, that if he would put the matter in their hands, and not yield to his rage, which could only work his own undoing, either his bride should be rendered up to him without a smirch upon her bridal veil, or else a punishment should be dealt out proportioned to the affront. And without delay, as a proof of the energy wherewith the noble tribunal would take action in the affair, Luigi Manetti, secretary to the Ten, was sent to Imola, where the Duke was reported to be, that he might explain to him the great displeasure with which the most serene republic viewed the outrage perpetrated upon their condottieri. At the same time the Council of Ten and the Doge sought out the French ambassador, entreating him to join with them and repair in person with Manenti to the Duke of Valentinois, and summon him, in the name of King Louis XII, immediately to send back to Venice the lady he had carried off. The two messengers arrived at Imola, where they found Caesar, who listened to their complaint with every mark of utter astonishment, denying that he had been in any way connected with the crime, nay, authorizing Manenti and the French ambassador to pursue the culprits, and promising that he would himself have the most active search carried on. The Duke appeared to act in such complete good faith that the envoys were for the moment hoodwinked, and themselves undertook a search of the most careful nature. They accordingly repaired to the exact spot and began to procure information. On the high road there had been found dead and wounded. A man had been seen going by at a gallop, carrying a woman in distress on his saddle. He had soon left the beaten track and plunged across country. A peasant coming home from working in the fields had seen him appear and vanish again like a shadow, taking the direction of a lonely house. An old woman declared that she had seen him go into this house, but the next night the house was gone, as though by enchantment, and the ploughshare had passed over where it stood, so that none could say what had become of her whom they sought, for those who had dwelt in the house, and even the house itself, were there no longer. Manenti and the French ambassador returned to Venice, and related what the Duke had said, what they had done, and how all search had been in vain. No one doubted that Caesar was the culprit, but none could prove it. So the most serene republic, which could not, considering their war with the Turks, be embroiled with the Pope, forbade Caracciolo to take any sort of private vengeance, and so the talk grew gradually less, and at last the occurrence was no more mentioned. But the pleasures of the winter had not diverted Caesar's mind from his plans about Faenza. Scarcely did the spring season allow him to go into the country than he marched anew upon the town, camped opposite the castle, and making a new breach, ordered a general assault, himself going up first of all. But in spite of the courage he personally displayed, and the able seconding of his soldiers, they were repulsed by Astor, who, at the head of his men, defended the breach, while even the women, at the top of the rampart, rolled down stones and trunks of trees upon the besiegers. After an hour's struggle man to man, Caesar was forced to retire, leaving 2,000 men in the trenches about the town, and among the 2,000 one of his bravest condottieri, Valentino Farnese. Then, seeing that neither excommunications nor assaults could help him, Caesar converted the siege into a blockade. All the roads leading to Faenza were cut off, all communications stopped, and further, as various signs of revolt had been remarked at Cesena, a governor was installed there whose powerful will was well known to Caesar, Ramiro d'Orco, with powers of life and death over the inhabitants. He then waited quietly before Faenza, till hunger should drive out the citizens from those walls they defended with such vehement enthusiasm. At the end of a month, during which the people of Faenza had suffered all the horrors of famine, delegates came out to parley with Caesar, with a view to capitulation. Caesar, who still had plenty to do in the Romagna, was less hard to satisfy than might have been expected, and the town yielded on condition that he should not touch either the persons or the belongings of the inhabitants; that Alstor Manfredi, the youthful ruler, should have the privilege of retiring whenever he pleased, and should enjoy the revenue of his patrimony wherever he might be. The conditions were faithfully kept so far as the inhabitants were concerned, but Caesar, when he had seen Astor, whom he did not know before, was seized by a strange passion for this beautiful youth, who was like a woman. He kept him by his side in his own army, showing him honours befitting a young prince, and evincing before the eyes of all the strongest affection for him. One day Astor disappeared, just as Caracciolo's bride had disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. Caesar himself appeared very uneasy, saying that he had no doubt made his escape somewhere, and in order to give credence to this story, he sent out couriers to seek him in all directions. A year after this double disappearance, there was picked up in the Tiber, a little below the castle Sant' Angelo, the body of a beautiful woman, her hands bound together behind her back, and also the corpse of a handsome youth, with the bowstring he had been strangled with tied around his neck. The girl was Caracciolo's bride, the young man was Astor. During the last year both had been the slaves of Caesar's pleasures. Now tired of them, he had had them thrown into the Tiber. The capture of Faenza had brought Caesar the title of Duke of Romagna, which was first bestowed on him by the Pope in full consistory, and afterwards ratified by the King of Hungary, the Republic of Venice, and the Kings of Castile and Portugal. The news of the ratification arrived at Rome on the eve of the day on which the people are accustomed to keep the anniversary of the foundation of the Eternal City. This fete, which went back to the days of Pomponius Laetus, acquired a new splendour in their eyes from the joyful events that had just happened to their sovereign. As a sign of joy, cannon were fired all day long. In the evening there were illuminations and bonfires, and during part of the night the Prince of Squillace, with the chief lords of the Roman nobility, marched about the streets, bearing torches and exclaiming, "Long live Alexander! Long live Caesar! Long live the Borgias! Long live the Orsini! Long live the Duke of Romagna!" Section 21.